Andiamo zitti la mano, perché lo stiamo facendo una balla, ma si vede che molla, mi sembra molla per sopra la si vuole la mattina, quando facciamo la mattina, cosa ci può la mattina,
Welcome to Communicology. I'm Richard Talbert. I'm an associate professor of communication and media, and I love studying how people communicate. I'm also interested in how communication and culture interact. Today, I want to talk about law, not like some stuffy discussion about individual cases and why powdered wigs were a thing. I'm not interested in that right now. I'm more interested in a conversation I had with my students earlier today that I thought would be good fodder for discussion today. And that is, why do we even have law? Why do laws even exist? And how do laws communicate to us how we should act, how we should interact, how we should behave, that kind of thing? Well, if you think about it from a very basic standpoint, when you're by yourself, you don't have law. You're just by yourself and doing what you do as an individual, and you don't think too much about law. You just think about how you're to act and what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to, move through your day to get your food, your shelter, your clothing, whatever. It's when you add another person that we see the need for law. Because as soon as I add another person, then theft can become a thing. Murder can become a thing. And any other kind of problem that we have with other people becomes a thing. I mean, you don't steal from yourself. You don't murder yourself. And you start looking at, you don't defame yourself. You don't tell lies about yourself. You just, that's when another person comes in. And we start forming into groups. We start forming into communities. And we start forming into larger societies. We need something to keep us reined in. So if you think of the idea of laws, think of them basically as guardrails. And maybe not even guardrails. Maybe it's more like the center line that goes down the road. Because realistically, guardrails stop you from going off the road. Laws don't necessarily stop you. They tell you this is where you should stop. But, when you come with the law, it's more like the center line. When you're driving down the road and you have someone coming the other way, what keeps them from hitting you? What keeps you from hitting them? You're going down the road 60 miles an hour. They're coming at you 60 miles an hour. That little piece of paint in between you two isn't going to stop either one of you. It's all based on trust. I trust that you are going to stay in your lane. I'm going to stay in my lane. And ideally, we'll just pass by each other, no big deal. But if one of us veers off, that's going to be a very bad situation. And when you think about the way law works, it's like that. I trust that you're going to conduct yourself in a certain way. And you trust that I'm going to conduct myself in a certain way. And if we do, we're good. But what happens when one of us doesn't? Well, then we have a violation of the law. So when I was teaching my communication law class today, we were working at the idea of, well, what's it even mean to, violate law? How does that even come to pass? Where do we even get laws? Well, what I did is I just opened up Exodus 20 with them and started walking them through the 10 Commandments. And you look at the 10 Commandments that are laid out, so there's the Decalogue. The 10 Decalogue, means 10 words. So we have the 10 laws that we have in the 10 Commandments, and we see those. The first 4 make up the things that on how we should interact with God. The second group, the second table, the 6 that remain, are how we interact with our fellow man. And then we start talking about things from a communication law standpoint, and we start seeing how you can easily understand why those things were picked. I mean, if we were left to our own devices, would we pick some of the things that were picked? And if we were told, make a list of 10 laws that you would have for your new country, would you pick things like honor your parents? Would you pick things like thou shalt not covet? I mean, murder is easy. Yeah, don't commit murder. That's easy. Don't steal. That's easy. We can put that one in there too. But coveting? I mean, you think about us and our nature, we want things. And it's not like us as adults. Watch small children, little children as they're playing. One has a toy, another one comes into the room. This child is perfectly content and happy with this toy. This child all of a sudden wants that toy, and they take it. And that creates all kinds of problems. Next thing you know, it quickly escalates to assault. And they start hitting each other, and they're just little children. It's like, how do they know to do such things? It's not like they've been schooled on how to properly beat up each other. It's one of those things that we inherently have in our sinful nature, this desire to act in a way that needs to be restrained. And God knows this, and God knew this, and that's why he set up the 10 Commandments to give us guidelines of how to act. And again, those laws don't stop us. Thou shalt not murder. Yet murders happen every day around the world. Thou shalt not steal. Yet theft happens every day around the world. So it's more like that yellow line down the middle of the road, and we just have to trust each other that we'll stay in our lane. But from a communication standpoint, one of the biggest things that we see when we're not looking at things like murder and how murder's adjudicated. We look at things more along the lines of when communication interacts with law. So we see things like, the way we defame each other and slander each other. And when you look at those things, you're like, well, where's that in the 10 Commandments? Well, we saw in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said that if you speak ill of your brother, that's the same as murder. And we tend to think, wait a minute, that's not exactly what I had in mind with murder. But that's the importance of the 10 Commandments, because it tells us, here's our general guidelines. And when you start thinking them through, what's it, if I'm harming my brother, what does that really mean? What does that look like? It's an affront. It's an affront to that person, but that person carries the imago Dei, the image of God, so it's an affront to God as well. And then the idea of, for example, adultery. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Clear, simple, easy to understand that. But Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said, if you look with lust at another woman, you've committed adultery in your heart. It's like, whoa, now we're talking about a lot of things that come into play, especially in the world of communication. You look at commercials, you look at printed ads in magazines, you look at stuff that you scroll through on social media, movies. I mean, there's lust abounding there. I mean, it's all over the place. You can't get away from it. Whether it's men or women wearing little clothing and being very revealing and acting very sexualized, or just the sheer amount of pornography that's out there and available. It's one of those things that you can see how it intersects quickly into the realm of communication, which is, why when I teach communication law, it's from that standpoint. We don't get heavily into like business law or environmental law or some of these other things. We're focusing mostly on communication, how it's done. But one of the biggest things that we tend to focus on, and where we focused mostly in class today, was the idea of the spoken word. So we were talking about just insults. Is an insult a violation of law? Well, in America, we have our First Amendment. As we talked about in the earlier episode on the primer of the First Amendment, we looked at the idea that you have freedom of speech. So I can say things. And we tend to think, well, you're going to use that for good, right? Well, we'd like to think that people will. But where do insults fall? Well, legally, you're allowed to insult people. But what about the basis in law when we look at things like from the Decalogue? Well, we see there, thou shalt not murder, then backed up later by the Sermon on the Mount about speaking ill of your brother being equivalent to murder. So now we have a violation. So which is in the right, Well, obviously, Scripture takes precedence over the Constitution, and that's just the way it works. Whether you're a Christian or not, that's how it works, because just because you're not a Christian doesn't mean that God's law doesn't apply to you. But legally, in the United States, you can insult people. But the problem also comes with defining insult. What's an insult? If you like to just jab and poke with your friends, and think how many friends you have that you do have this kind of little wrestle with, or you like to poke at them or say things. I mean, it's not uncommon. I mean, growing up, Generation X, like one of our favorite go-to phrases was "your mom," and we'd say something about your mom, and we'd make your mom jokes all the time. That's pretty insulting. But if it's part of your language, am I insulting you? I mean, well, then we start getting to intent. Well, what's my intent of my heart? Am I trying to insult you? Am I trying to hurt you in some kind of way? But then we also wrestle with the idea of, well, how's it received? How's it, how does someone receive it? How does someone perceive it? Do they think like you are actually trying to insult me? Even if I'm joking with you, but you take it as an insult. So you can see where this gets really sticky, especially when you start looking at trying to define what an insult is and how we can then frame that in some kind of legal, mumbo jumbo to make it, applicable in a courtroom. That's why we have across the pond all kinds of problems going on with people getting arrested for memes and people getting arrested for making comments against the government. I mean, England has been doing that for centuries, but it's now reared its ugly head. I mean, it's, the reason why we have our First Amendment is because we have so much history of seeing how England would just punish the daylights out of anyone who dared insult the Queen or the King or any member of the royal family. And you would get punished. Maybe you would have your cheek branded with an S for slander. Maybe you would have your hand lopped off because you wrote something bad about the King or the Queen. Maybe they'd take off the whole head, and that would be your punishment. So when our founders set up our country, they said, we don't want that. And then also we tend to see that kind of thing when we were here too. I mean, there's a famous trial called the Zenger trial, a gentleman by the name of Peter Zenger, who was a publisher in New York, and he was writing an expose about the royal governor, William Cosby, of the governor of New York. And he was exposing his misdeeds in office as a royal governor. Well, Zenger got thrown in jail because Cosby didn't like being insulted and being called corrupt. Well, the thing that was interesting is, by the merits of the law, Zenger was guilty. He did insult and damage the reputation of Cosby. However, the jurors saw things differently. They said, but he is corrupt. So he's telling the truth. So why should someone get in trouble for telling the truth? One person took it as an insult. The other person was speaking truth. Which one wins? Well, in the case of in the Zenger case, Zenger was found not guilty because the merits of the case is that he was telling the truth about Cosby, about him being a corrupt governor. That was another key part of a foundation of our First Amendment, to being able to say what is on your mind, and to be able to, if it's factual, that you would be okay, you'd be covered. That's pivotal, because then we're moving in truth and fact into it, not opinion, not perception. So again, if you were to call somebody stupid or ugly, well, do you have quantifiable data to back that up? Because if you're just insulting them, I mean, one, from a Christian standpoint, why would you do that? But from a legal standpoint, I'm running the risk of causing them harm. Well, is calling someone stupid harm them? Well, that's where things get really difficult, because in defamation cases, when you defame somebody, we know what it is to give somebody fame. People want to be famous. But when you take that fame away, you're defaming them. So you're damaging their reputation to where maybe they can't make a living, or their reputation around town has been tarnished, or anything that takes them down from where they were. The hard part is, of course, proving that they were dropped down. Now, if they were making X amount of money and now they're making X minus whatever, that's fairly simple. But that their reputation has been dropped down is a little bit harder to prove, because how can you prove you were here? How can you prove you're now here? And it was because of what I've said. So usually when you have defamation cases, it comes down to the concept of truth. Did you tell the truth? So, Richard, you're ugly. Well, oh well. And it depends on who you ask. I mean, I imagine my mom thinks I'm handsome, but, someone else might think I'm ugly. So that's a very much subjective thing. And that's really difficult to quantify. Richard, you're dumb. Well, I hope I'm kind of smart, but then again, there's some things I've done that are dumb. So how do you quantify that with an IQ test or something, an SAT score? I mean, what makes somebody smart or somebody dumb? So you can see where just straight up insults are hard to legally wrestle with. It's when you go after something and accuse them of things that become very, very difficult. Now, typically in defamation, you have two different ways. You have slander and you have libel. Slander, easy to remember, starts with S. Slander for the spoken word. So if I say something in the public sphere about somebody, and it's false and it defames them, it's meant to damage them, now we have slander. Now, with libel, it's something that's broadcast. So I hop on here and I broadcast to the world some awful insult about somebody, and it's not true. Not just an insult, but something terrible, like calling somebody like a pedophile or something like that when they're not. That can, obviously bring them down, because a pedophile is a very disregarded term that we have very, very low view of people who are pedophiles. So calling somebody that would defame them pretty quickly. Now, the thing is, if it's not true, I have willfully, with the intent of causing harm, labeled somebody in such a way that defamed them, that ruined their standing. That would set me up for a defamation lawsuit. Now, in the real world, when we're face to face, I say something you don't like. I mean, I might get punched in the face. So instead of a lawsuit, I just get bopped. But that's one of those things that we have to wrestle with is, when I hop on social media, can I just say what I want? I have freedom of speech. Well, you have to realize that people also have the right to have some level of privacy, and they have the right to not have their person attacked, especially in a untruthful manner. So whose right wins? Well, you don't get damaged by not being able to insult somebody and lie about them, but someone else would get damaged if you did lie about them. So their rights typically trump the idea of speech. So speech in that situation is restricted, but it's only restricted because it went up against another right, and one right won the day over speech. But the thing is, at the end of the day, when you do hop on social media, or when you're out and about, and you have that opportunity to speak your mind, should you? You go back to the key scene in Jurassic Park when they're sitting around eating the Chilean sea bass, and they're having that discussion about how they could charge so much money for tickets and how the park is going to be run. And Ian Malcolm, played by Jeff Goldblum, stops and says, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could make the dinosaurs, they never stopped to think whether they should. And that's one of those things when it comes to this thing here. Should we be so fast to speak and say injurious, insulting things? Or should we be so fast to run our little thumbs over the keyboard and say those injurious, insulting things? It might be legal. It might be totally fine to call somebody stupid or ugly or fat or whatever. But should we? That's not exactly fair to them. It's definitely not loving, and it's certainly not Christ-like. And you don't even have to be a Christian to realize that's a pretty lousy thing to do to somebody. So, but what about when they insult you? Don't I get a free pass to go back? Where's that ever written? I mean, scripturally, no, you're not supposed to, you don't get a free insult back. You turn the other cheek. So why do I feel the need that I get to do that kind of a thing? But see, it's really challenging because, we have the ability to do it. I can physically do it. And the law is on my side. I can do it. I can say that insult. But that's our criminal law. That's our civil law. It doesn't quite fit with God's law. It doesn't quite fit with ecclesiastical law, the law of the church. So you can see where this becomes a problem, and where with the students where we can wrestle, because when it comes to things like speech, like who gets to say what's an insult? And you start wrestling with the concept of, well, I felt insulted by that, and it's usually the receiver who gets to make the rule. So that's one thing that we have to be thinking about is, before I open my mouth, should I? And when I do open my mouth, what will I say? And just because I can doesn't mean that I should. So when you're thinking about law, again, that's just that center line. It's just trust. I'm trusting that you're going to stay in your lane. I'm going to stay in mine. It's not a guardrail that stops you from going off. It's just that center line, and just defines that trust. So for us to work in a civil society, I have to trust that you're going to speak and type and act in such a way that's beneficial, for society and for our relationship. And then you have to trust that I'm going to do the same. So that's something I want you to think about, is how we keep working on being better communicators, regardless of where we stand with the law. Thank you very much for tuning into Communicology. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you didn't like what you heard today, that's okay. Thank you for hanging around this long. But we'll see you next time on Communicology.